The storm was a beast that night, howling winds and heavy rain battering against the cabin windows. Riven had been used to these kinds of storms living out in the middle of nowhere, but something about tonight felt different. The air was charged with a strange, almost electric tension. He had pulled the blanket tighter around himself and turned up the heater, trying to settle in for a quiet night of reading, but then he heard it, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. It came from the bed. At first, he thought it was just the storm, but then came the movement. Something warm and soft pressed against his side. His heart skipped a beat as he shot upright, shining the flashlight around. His eyes landed on a figure lying next to him, nestled under the covers. It was a woman, beautiful in a way he couldn't fully explain. Her skin was pale, but with a faint, glowing sheen. Her dark, silver-flecked hair spilled across the pillow, and her eyes, huge, wide, and unervingly luminous, opened slowly, meeting his gaze. What are you doing in my bed?" Riven stammered, his voice thick with confusion and surprise. She blinked, clearly disoriented. "I was cold," she whispered in a voice that sounded like a song. Her accent was unfamiliar, a melody all its own. Riven's brain was trying to catch up, but all he could do was stare at her, utterly frozen. He had no idea who she was, or how she'd gotten into his cabin, but here she was, curled up next to him, looking more vulnerable than anyone he'd ever seen. What are you?" he managed to ask, still trying to comprehend the situation. The woman shifted slightly, her delicate features barely visible in the dim light. "I'm not from here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't seem frightened. In fact, she almost seemed relieved. "Please. I didn't mean to intrude. The storm is not safe for me." Riven couldn't form a coherent thought. Instead, he found himself reacting on instinct, fumbling to pull the blanket around her, unsure of what was going on but unwilling to throw her out in the middle of a freak storm. "You're telling me you're not from around here, and you just crawled into my bed?" Her eyes flickered with something like sadness. "I didn't know where else to go." Riven was still reeling from the strangeness of the situation when the wind howled again, rattling the cabin. He stared at her for a moment longer, wondering if he was dreaming. She seemed so otherworldly. There was something about her, something mesmerizing. He shook himself and forced his mind to focus. "All right. You're not from around here. But you're gonna have to explain how you got here." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Her glowing eyes flickered, dimming slightly as if she was uncertain. Finally, she spoke again. "I crash-landed." Riven raised an eyebrow. "Crash-landed? Are you?" "I'm not from your world," she said, her gaze intense, almost pleading. "I'm not supposed to be here." Riven tried to process what she said. Alien. His brain couldn't wrap around the idea. But there she was, sitting in his bed, looking like she belonged in some kind of fantasy tale. He shook his head. "This can't be happening." "I know it's hard to understand," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I need to rest. Please, let me stay. Just for a little while." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow quieter, the storm outside fading into the background. There was something in her gaze that made Riven's heart beat faster, an unspoken connection that was starting to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness. He sighed, glancing toward the door. The storm was only getting worse. He could hear the wind pounding against the walls. As much as he wanted to ask more questions, to figure out exactly what was happening, he knew he didn't have the heart to turn her away. "Fine," he said, still trying to make sense of it all. "You can stay for now. But when the storm's over, we're talking. I need answers." She smiled, and it was like the room brightened just a little bit. "Thank you." Riven settled back down, though the presence beside him made it impossible to sleep. His thoughts raced, but as he lay there, he found himself glancing over at her more often than he cared to admit. She wasn't just an alien, he realized. She was different. There was a strange energy about her that he couldn't quite explain, something magnetic, like he was drawn to her in a way he couldn't control. But what was happening? And who, or what, was she? The morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting soft beams across the room. Riven awoke slowly, the events of the previous night still swirling in his mind. His body felt heavy, but not from sleep, more like he'd been carrying the weight of something unexplainable all night. He turned his head and found her, Valen. He learned her name just after he'd drifted off, still asleep beside him. She looked peaceful now, almost ethereal in the daylight, her silver-flecked hair spread across the pillow like some kind of celestial tapestry. For a moment, Riven simply stared at her, wondering if this was all some strange, vivid dream. But then she shifted, and her eyes fluttered open, locking with his. There was no shock in her gaze, no hint of alarm. She merely blinked slowly, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to wake up next to a stranger. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice thick with the remnants of sleep. Riven cleared his throat, unsure of how to react. "Morning. You slept well, I assume." She smiled faintly, though there was something almost sad about it. "I did. I was safe." There was an odd finality in her tone that made Riven uneasy. He couldn't tell if she was referring to the storm, or something else entirely. "What exactly happened last night?" Riven finally asked, unable to hold back any longer. "You said you're not from here. That doesn't make sense." How is that possible?" Valen sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She seemed to gather her thoughts for a moment before responding, as though she was deciding just how much to tell him. "I'm from a faraway place," she began, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "A place far beyond the stars. My kind, my people, we're not like humans. We're connected to the energy of the universe in ways you wouldn't understand." Riven frowned, listening intently. He was still having trouble wrapping his head around it, but he needed answers. "So, you're telling me you're from another planet?" "Yes," Valen replied, her eyes flickering with something deeper. "I'm not just any alien. I'm from a royal lineage. And I've been running." "Running?" Riven repeated. "From who?" She hesitated, looking out the window as though trying to gather the courage to speak. "I was chosen for someone. My kind mate." Her voice grew quieter with each word, like she was ashamed to say it. "But I didn't want it. I didn't want to be bonded to someone I didn't choose. And when I refused, they pursued me. They've been hunting me ever since." Riven's eyes widened as the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just a random crash landing. Valen wasn't just some lost traveler. She was a fugitive, a royal fugitive, on the run from whatever force had the power to track her across the stars. "That's insane," Riven muttered. "You're saying someone's after you because you didn't want to be mated to them?" Valen nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes. It's how our people live. We're matched before we're born, bonded to another from the moment we're conceived. But not everyone wants it. Not everyone believes in it." She paused, her gaze flickering back to him. I couldn't live that way." Riven wasn't sure how to respond. His head was spinning. Everything he thought he knew about the world had just been appended in a single night. But the more he listened to Valen, the more he felt an overwhelming urge to protect her. "How long have you been running?" he asked softly. "For years," she replied, the sadness in her voice making Riven's chest tighten. "I thought I could outrun them. But I'm tired. I'm so tired." Riven stared at her, trying to understand what she must have gone through. Being hunted, chased, trapped in a life she didn't want. "I can't help you much," he said after a long silence. "But I'll protect you for as long as I can. You're safe here. For now." A flicker of surprise passed across Valen's face, followed by a warmth that seemed to spread throughout the room. "You would protect me?" she asked, almost as if she couldn't quite believe it. Riven nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was getting himself into. "I don't know what else to do. I can't just send you back out there." Valen's smile was faint, but it was enough to make Riven's heart flutter unexpectedly. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glowing brighter than before, almost like they were reflecting the gratitude she felt. As the days passed, Riven and Valen settled into an uneasy routine. The storm had passed, but the world outside felt foreign and strange. Riven would keep watch, checking the surrounding woods, wondering if anyone was following her. And Valen, well, she seemed to grow more and more anxious with each passing day. Then, one night, after a particularly long silence between them, Valen turned to him and said something that took Riven by surprise. You don't know what it feels like, she said quietly, her voice almost breaking, to be wanted by someone you can't love. To be forced into a bond you never asked for. I didn't expect to feel this way with you. Riven felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What do you mean? He asked, though his heart already had a sinking feeling. Valen met his gaze, her eyes shining with something tender, something he hadn't expected. You make me feel safe. Not like I'm some object to be owned. But like I belong here. With you. Riven's breath caught in his throat. The air between them seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, something delicate and fragile that he couldn't ignore. He swallowed hard, the words slipping out before he could stop them. I don't know what's happening, but I can't deny that. I feel it too. Her smile was slow, hesitant, but full of a quiet, undeniable warmth. And in that moment, Riven knew, whatever was happening between them, whatever this connection was, it was real. The next few days felt like they were suspended in time. Riven couldn't quite shake the feeling that everything around him had changed. The world outside his cabin, once so familiar, now felt like a distant memory. He had never expected to be in this situation, caught between something strange, something out of his control. But every time he looked at Valen, his heart beat faster. It wasn't just the mystery of her, or her otherworldly beauty. There was something else, something deeper that pulled him toward her, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, he couldn't escape it. She had stayed in the cabin for days now, watching the horizon for signs of anyone pursuing her. Riven did what he could to help, gathering food, checking the perimeter, trying to keep the cabin hidden. But the more time they spent together, the more the tension between them built. One evening, after Riven had brought in some firewood, he noticed that Valen was standing by the window, staring out at the stars. She looked so small, so fragile against the vastness of the night sky. He approached her quietly, not wanting to startle her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Valen didn't immediately respond, her gaze still locked on the sky. "I'm not used to this," she finally said, her voice soft but laced with uncertainty. "I've never been without my people before. Without my kind." Riven felt a pang of sympathy for her. He couldn't imagine what it would be like, being torn from everything you knew, chased by your own kind, forced into a life you never wanted. "You're not alone here," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than he intended. She turned to look at him, her eyes soft but conflicted. "I know. But I feel so lost. I don't know who I am without them. Without the bond." Riven didn't know how to respond. The bond she spoke of, the one that tied her to someone she didn't love, was something beyond his comprehension. But in that moment, he realized something important. He wasn't just offering her safety. He was offering her something else, something that neither of them had expected. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said, stepping closer to her. Valen's breath hitched as she looked at him, her gaze flickering from his eyes to his lips. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the distance between them shrinking until there was nothing left but the quiet crackling of the fire and the sound of their breathing. And then, without thinking, without warning, Valen stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, like she wasn't sure if she should be doing this, but it didn't matter. Riven's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, his heart racing as he kissed her back. The kiss deepened, more urgent now, and in that moment, everything made sense. All the confusion, the fear, the questions, they melted away, leaving only the feeling that, despite everything, this was right. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, staring at each other like they'd just crossed some invisible line. I didn't mean to," Valen began, her voice shaky. Riven shook his head, cutting her off. "Don't apologize." He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. "I feel it too." Valen took a step back, her face flushed with the intensity of the moment. "But I'm not." "You're not what?" Riven asked, taking her hand gently, pulling her back to him. "You're not what?" "Different." "You think I care about that?" She hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what this means. I don't even know who I am anymore. I'm not from your world. I'm lost." "You're not lost to me," Riven said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Valen looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and something else, something like hope. And in that moment, Riven realized just how much he had changed in the last few days. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was beginning to care about her in a way that went far beyond just offering refuge. Something had shifted between them, something undeniable. Later that night, they sat together by the fire, a quiet stillness between them. Riven couldn't help but steal glances at her, watching the way the firelight danced across her features. Valen seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant again, like she was somewhere far away. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but he knew that wasn't something you could force. Instead, he reached over and gently brushed a lock of hair away from her face, causing her to look up at him. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Valen didn't say anything. Then, finally, she smiled, small, but genuine. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of gratitude that made Riven's chest tighten. And though he knew the world outside was still full of dangers, full of questions they hadn't yet answered, in that moment, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them only deepened. The tension, the uncertainty, the danger, it was all still there, but they found solace in each other. Riven realized he wasn't just offering her a safe haven, he was giving her a chance to choose her own path, to find her own way, free from the chains of a life she never asked for. And Valen. She was learning to trust again, to believe that she could have something of her own, a love that wasn't forced, a future she could choose. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The days blurred into each other, the quiet life they had carved out together in the small cabin becoming more and more of a reality. Riven had almost forgotten what it was like to have someone so close, someone who could share the silence with him without feeling like it was an awkward thing. With Valen, every moment seemed to flow, even when they didn't speak. But Riven knew that the peace they'd found wasn't going to last forever. There were still so many unanswered questions, about Valen, about her people, and the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. And though she seemed to find comfort in their quiet moments, Riven could see the fear in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The kind of fear that comes from knowing you're not safe, no matter how much you want to believe it. One morning, Riven woke early to the sound of soft whispers. He rubbed his eyes, still half-dazed from sleep, and turned his head toward the source of the sound. Valen stood near the window, her back to him, speaking in a low voice. It wasn't to him, it was almost as if she was talking to someone else. Riven didn't move immediately, unsure of what to do. Was she communicating with someone? Was she reaching out to her people? Her words were soft, and though he couldn't make out everything she said, there was one word that sent a chill down his spine: bonded. Riven's heart raced as he slowly pushed himself up, his body stiff from lying in bed for so long. He had to know what was going on. Slowly, he rose and made his way over to her, his feet light on the creaky floorboards. "Valen," he called gently, his voice cautious, as though afraid of breaking the fragile moment. She turned quickly, her eyes wide with alarm. The look in her eyes, a mixture of guilt and fear, struck him harder than he expected. Valen didn't speak right away. Instead, she glanced nervously out the window, as though she was checking for something, or someone. "Who were you talking to?" Riven asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to sound accusing, but there was an edge of concern there, something he couldn't shake. Valen hesitated, then closed her eyes briefly, like she was gathering the strength to speak. "I wasn't talking to anyone. I was just trying to reach out." "To him?" "Him?" Riven asked, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He already knew the answer, but hearing it out loud made the weight of it even heavier. She nodded, her gaze distant. "The one I was meant to bond with. My kind mate." Riven's stomach twisted. The bond she had spoken of, the one she'd tried to escape, was not just a figurative thing. It was real. "You were trying to reach him?" His voice was almost a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would make the situation worse. "Why? After everything?" "I don't want it," Valen said quickly, her voice desperate. "I don't want the bond. I never did. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I can feel him, feel the connection, pulling at me. It's like I can't escape it. I need to break it completely, but I can't." Riven's heart clenched as he reached out for her, his hands gently cupping her face, forcing her to look at him. "You don't have to do this alone. You're not alone, Valen. We'll figure this out together. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, and for a brief moment, Riven was certain she was about to tell him the truth, to reveal the full extent of what had been haunting her. But then, her eyes snapped open again, and the fear was back, stronger than before. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it. I've been running for so long, and now they found me." Riven's pulse quickened as the weight of her words settled in. He had known, deep down, that it was never going to be as simple as just hiding away in the cabin. Her past, her people, they would find her eventually. But hearing her say it out loud, he could feel the fear in her voice, the terror that had been building ever since she arrived. "Who's coming for you?" he demanded, his hands trembling slightly as they dropped from her face. "How do you know?" "I can sense them," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't know how, but I can feel their presence. The bond, it's not just something I can turn off. They know I'm trying to escape it, and they won't stop until I'm—" She broke off, a sob escaping her lips before she could finish. Riven didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning. He had no idea what kind of force could track someone across the stars, but if Valen's words were true, they wouldn't be safe for long. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "We can't stay here. Not with them so close." "No," Valen said quickly, shaking her head. "You can't come with me. They'll follow you too. It's too dangerous." Riven's heart sank at her words. The idea of losing her, of letting her leave alone, was unbearable. But he could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that if he stayed, it would only put him in more danger. Still, the thought of being apart from her, it hurt. "You're not going alone," Riven said with quiet resolve. "I'm coming with you. We'll face this together, Valen. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out. Together." Valen's eyes softened, but her expression was filled with uncertainty. "You don't know what you're asking, Riven. I can't promise you that you'll be safe. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." But Riven took her hands in his, squeezing them tightly. "I don't care about that. You matter more than anything else." For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. The storm, the danger, everything felt distant, like it didn't matter when she was with him. And in that moment, Riven knew, no matter what came next, he would follow her into the unknown. He couldn't let her face this alone. The air outside had grown colder, the wind picking up in gusts as if nature itself was aware of the tension building between Riven and Valen. They stood in the small cabin, both of them preparing for what lay ahead, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had no idea what they were truly up against. Still, there was no turning back now. Riven wasn't about to let her leave alone, not when she needed him most. They packed what little they could carry, Riven's mind racing with thoughts of how they could possibly escape the danger that was closing in. The cabin had been a refuge, a temporary hiding place. But now it felt like a trap, and every second they stayed here, the walls seemed to get tighter. As they made their way to the door, Valen hesitated, her fingers lingering on the handle. "I'm scared, Riven," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running for so long, and I'm so tired. I don't know what to do anymore." Riven stepped closer to her, his hand resting on her shoulder in an attempt to reassure her. "You don't have to be afraid. We'll find a way out of this. Together." His voice was steady, though the fear gnawing at him was impossible to ignore. He had no idea how they were going to outrun the kind of danger she had been facing, but there was one thing he was sure of. He would protect her with everything he had. Valen nodded slowly, but there was a lingering uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she believed him or if she even believed in herself anymore. But she was still here, still willing to trust him despite everything. They left the cabin together, stepping into the cold, star-filled night. The forest around them seemed alive, the shadows deeper than usual, as if watching them, waiting. Riven kept a tight grip on her hand, leading her through the trees with determination. He had no plan, no real direction, but he was certain of one thing: they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They needed to move, to keep ahead of whatever was hunting her. They didn't speak much during the walk, both of them lost in their thoughts, but Riven couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. There was something wrong, something that he couldn't quite place. Valen's presence beside him was comforting, but it also made him feel vulnerable, as though they were already being watched. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the wind had grown sharper, and the first traces of dawn were beginning to break through the dark sky. Riven turned to Valen, his brow furrowed. "We need to find somewhere safer," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Somewhere to rest, to plan." Valen nodded, her expression distant as she scanned their surroundings. "I know a place," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but steady. "A hidden sanctuary, far from here. It's not far, but it's well protected. We can stay there for a while." Without waiting for his response, she started walking, her pace quickening as if she knew the way by heart. Riven followed her closely, not questioning her decision. He trusted her, even if he didn't fully understand everything about her world. The journey took them deeper into the mountains, where the terrain became rough and the air thinner. Riven struggled to keep up, but he didn't complain. There was a sense of urgency in Valen's movements, something almost frantic in the way she moved as though time was running out. After what felt like hours of navigating steep cliffs and thick brush, they reached a hidden valley, surrounded by high stone walls. It was a secluded, almost magical place, untouched by the outside world. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, Riven wondered if they had somehow stepped into another realm entirely. Valen slowed her pace, her expression softening as she looked around. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "This is where I've hidden before. It's safe here, well, for now." Riven breathed a sigh of relief, the tension in his chest easing as he looked around the quiet valley. The stone walls that surrounded them seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and though the landscape was wild and untouched, there was a sense of tranquility here that he hadn't felt in days. They made their way to a small, hidden cave within the valley, where Valen said they could rest for the night. The entrance was narrow, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Once inside, Valen set down her pack and leaned against the cool stone wall, her eyes closing as if she was finally able to breathe for the first time in ages. Riven sat beside her, his mind still racing. "We'll be okay here for a while, right?" he asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. "For now," Valen replied, her voice quiet but assured. "But it's only a matter of time before they find me again. I can feel the bond tightening. I can feel them getting closer." Riven turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear or hesitation. "We'll figure this out. Together. I promise." Valen met his gaze, her eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something that made Riven's heart race. She reached out and gently took his hand in hers, her fingers warm against his. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You don't have to stay. You've already done more than anyone else ever has. I don't want to drag you into this mess. You deserve a life of peace." Riven shook his head, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't care about peace. Not anymore." He squeezed her hand. "I care about you. And if that means facing whatever's coming, then I'm ready. We'll fight this together, Valen. I won't leave you." The warmth in Valen's eyes was the only answer he needed. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. In that moment, she knew he would stay by her side, no matter the cost. But as the night wore on, a feeling of unease settled over them both. Something was coming. Valen could feel it, as if the bond between her and her kindmate was drawing her closer to the danger she had been running from all along. And Riven, he had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The days in the hidden valley passed slowly, the quiet only interrupted by the occasional gust of wind or the distant calls of animals. For a brief moment, it felt like Riven and Valen had found a sanctuary, a place far removed from the chaos that had been chasing her. But the unease never fully left them. Valen had grown quieter with each passing day, her thoughts clearly elsewhere, and Riven could feel the weight of the unspoken between them. He couldn't help but wonder how long they would really be safe here. One morning, as Riven woke to the sound of rustling outside the cave, he immediately tensed. He sat up quickly, heart pounding, the quiet of the valley now seeming eerie. Valen was already on her feet, her eyes wide, scanning the entrance with the alertness of someone who had been running for far too long. "They're close," Valen whispered, her voice strained with anxiety. "I can feel them. They've found us." Riven didn't hesitate. He knew this moment was coming, but the reality of it hit him harder than he expected. He scrambled to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "We need to go now," he urged, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here." Valen nodded, her expression tight with fear. She seemed to be struggling internally, torn between wanting to stay and fight and the instinct to run. Her people, whoever they were closing in, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had her back, whether she wanted it or not. The two of them quickly gathered what little they had, preparing to move as quickly as possible. Riven's mind raced, trying to figure out a plan, but the only thing he could focus on was the thought of losing her. He didn't care about the danger anymore. He didn't care about the consequences. He would fight to protect her, even if it meant giving up everything. "We need to head east," Valen said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "There's a pass through the mountains. If we can get there, we might be able to lose them. They won't follow us so easily if we're in the higher altitudes." Riven nodded, following her lead. He kept close, always checking over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of pursuit. The air was thick with tension as they moved quickly through the valley, their footsteps quick but careful, trying to remain as silent as possible. As they neared the edge of the valley, Valen stopped suddenly, her eyes wide with alarm. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. "They're here." Riven's heart stopped for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to her, his voice tight with urgency. "What do we do?" "They'll come for me," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she backed away from him. "I have to do something to hold them off. You can't stay. You have to go." Riven's world tilted on its axis. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice firm, though his mind screamed in protest. "We'll face them together. I'll fight for you." Valen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, Riven saw the full weight of her desperation. "You don't understand. If they catch you, if they know you're with me, they'll kill you, Riven. They'll make sure of it." "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice breaking through the cold, hard fear that was threatening to consume him. "I'll die before I leave you. I don't care what they'll do to me." Valen shook her head, her face pale and strained. "This isn't just about me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't let you risk your life because of me. I won't allow it." Before Riven could respond, a distant sound reached his ears, footsteps low and fast, echoing through the valley. His stomach twisted with dread. They were here. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "We don't have time for this," he said urgently. "We need to move now. We'll figure it out later. Together." Valen stared at him, the tension in her face slowly melting away. She knew he wasn't going to give up. The love in his eyes, the way he held her, spoke louder than words ever could. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Without another word, they turned and ran. The forest was dense, the ground uneven and difficult to navigate. But Riven pushed forward, driven by the need to protect her, by the bond that had formed between them in such a short amount of time. Valen kept pace with him, her movements fluid and graceful, though he could see the strain in her eyes. She wasn't used to running like this, not anymore. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the footsteps behind them grew louder, the sound of pursuit unmistakable. Valen's breath came in shallow bursts, but she didn't slow down. Riven could feel the tension building in his chest, the overwhelming sense of danger closing in around them. They reached the base of the mountain pass, but just as they were about to ascend, a group of figures appeared from behind the trees. The sight of them made Riven's heart drop into his stomach. They were tall, imposing, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. And there was no mistaking their intent. They had found them. Valen froze, her body tense, her eyes wide with terror. Riven immediately stepped in front of her, shielding her from the incoming threat. He could see the fear in her face, but he wasn't going to let her face this alone. The leader of the group, a tall figure with silver-gray hair and sharp, angular features, stepped forward. His voice was low and commanding. "Valen," he said, his tone cold. "You can't escape the bond. Come with us. It's not too late to return." Valen's eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't move. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm free now. The leader's eyes narrowed. You know what will happen if you resist. You know what you've chosen. Riven stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. She's not going anywhere with you, he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced in his chest. Not if I can help it. Valen's hand slipped into his, and for a brief moment, the connection between them was undeniable. The bond was real, but it wasn't one of control, it was one of choice. And she had chosen him. Stay behind me, Riven whispered, his voice filled with determination. As the group advanced, Riven knew this fight was inevitable. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for her. For them. The tension in the air thickened, the silence between them heavy with unspoken threats. Riven's heart pounded in his chest as the leader of the group took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Valen. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, but his focus never wavered. He would not let them take her. Valen's hand tightened around his, her presence beside him a constant, reassuring force. She didn't need to say anything, he knew that she had made her choice. And so had he. Step aside, human, the leader's voice was colder now, laced with irritation. This doesn't concern you. Riven's jaw tightened. He wasn't backing down. He stood firm, shoulders squared. She's not your property. She's not going anywhere with you. Valen's breath hitched behind him, her fingers lightly brushing his arm as if to ground herself. She didn't speak, but Riven could feel the weight of her emotions pressing down on them both. She was torn between wanting to fight and knowing what would happen if this escalated. We don't have time for this, the leader snapped, his eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. You'll regret this. The group behind him shifted, their movements fluid and eerily synchronized. Riven's pulse quickened. There were 5 of them, all strong, all confident. And despite everything, he knew they weren't just after Valen, they were after him, too. The air crackled with an energy Riven couldn't understand, a force that made his skin prickle with discomfort. He turned to Valen, his eyes meeting hers, his voice low but urgent. Are you ready? Valen's eyes were wide, her lips trembling with uncertainty. She nodded, though her fear was palpable. I don't know if I am, but we don't have a choice. Before he could react, the leader raised his hand, and in an instant, the group moved. The world seemed to slow as Riven's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Valen's arm and pulled her to the side just as the first of the group lunged at him. Riven barely had time to react, his body slamming into the ground as the attacker came down on him with surprising force. He grunted in pain but quickly recovered, pushing the figure off him. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for a large rock nearby to defend himself. The sound of fighting broke the stillness of the valley, and Valen's voice pierced through the chaos. Riven, behind you, she cried out. Riven spun just in time to block another attacker, the force of their collision knocking him backward. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to fight back, but he wasn't trained for this. His best hope was to protect Valen long enough for them to escape. But the group was relentless. They came at him from all sides, their movements fast and fluid, almost inhuman. His hands shook as he swung the rock, hitting one of the attackers in the side, but it barely slowed them down. He was outmatched. Riven's thoughts were consumed with one thing, keeping Valen safe. She had to escape. She had to survive. Suddenly, Valen was there, her eyes glowing with a fierce intensity. She stepped in front of him, her hand raised, and Riven watched in awe as she called upon a power he had never seen before. A surge of energy blasted from her palm, sending the attackers flying backward. The ground beneath them trembled as the force rippled outward. Go now! Valen shouted, her voice strained but commanding. Riven hesitated for only a moment, his gaze meeting hers. There was no time for doubt, no time for hesitation. He reached for her hand, pulling her with him as they sprinted toward the mountain pass. But the leader wasn't finished. With a growl of frustration, he lunged after them, his movements impossibly fast. Riven barely had time to react when the leader slammed into him, sending him crashing to the ground. No! Valen screamed, her voice raw with emotion as she rushed to Riven's side. The leader sneered, towering over him. You should have stayed out of this, human. She's mine. Riven gritted his teeth, the world spinning around him as he fought to stay conscious. He knew this was it, the end of the line. But then, something incredible happened. Valen stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a fierce, almost blinding light. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling with power. "You think you can control me, but you're wrong. I am not your possession. And I won't go back. Not now. Not ever." The leader's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. But before he could respond, Valen raised her hand, the power she wielded erupting with an intensity that shook the very ground beneath them. A blinding light exploded from her palm, and the leader staggered backward, his face contorted with shock and pain. Riven could hardly believe what he was seeing. The power Valen possessed was beyond anything he could comprehend. It was a force of nature, untamed, unstoppable. With one final burst of energy, Valen sent the leader crashing to the ground. The other attackers, stunned by the sudden shift in power, hesitated, fear creeping into their eyes. Valen stood tall, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with the intensity of her resolve. "This is the last warning," she said, her voice steady despite the toll the battle had taken on her. "Stay away from me. I will never go back." The remaining attackers took a step back, their expressions a mixture of anger and fear. They didn't move any closer. Without another word, Valen turned and grabbed Riven's hand, pulling him to his feet. Together, they ran, their bodies fueled by adrenaline, their hearts racing with the knowledge that they had narrowly escaped death. As they made their way up the mountain pass, the threat behind them faded into the distance. But Riven couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And no matter how powerful Valen's abilities were, he knew they couldn't run forever. But they would face whatever came next, together. The mountain pass was steep, the path narrow and treacherous. But they didn't stop. Their breath was ragged, the urgency of their escape propelling them forward as the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. Riven kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but his thoughts were consumed by the image of Valen standing strong against the attackers. She had saved him, again. But the danger wasn't over. Riven could feel it in his bones. The group would regroup, and they would come after them, harder, faster. They wouldn't give up. Valen's powers were formidable, but Riven knew they couldn't rely on them forever. As they reached a narrow ledge, Riven pulled Valen to a halt. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "We need to keep moving, but we can't keep running forever. We need a plan." Valen nodded, her face pale from the exertion, but her eyes still held the fire that had driven her to fight back. "I know," she whispered, her voice tight. "But I don't know what else to do. They won't stop, Riven. They won't rest until they have me back." Riven's hand reached for hers, squeezing it gently. "Then we'll fight. We'll make our stand together. You're not alone in this." She met his gaze, her lips trembling with emotion. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "I don't know what they'll do to you, to us, if they catch us." Riven's heart ached for her. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be fine, but deep down, he knew the truth. They were up against something they didn't fully understand, something powerful and dangerous. But he also knew that as long as they had each other, they had a fighting chance. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up on him. "We'll find a way to make them leave us alone. Together." Valen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Together," she repeated, a small smile breaking through the tension in her face. Just as they were about to continue, a soft rumble echoed through the mountains, followed by a gust of wind that sent a chill through the air. Riven's eyes narrowed. Something didn't feel right. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the narrow pass behind them, but there was no sign of the attackers. "Riven," Valen whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "There's something wrong. I can feel it." He turned to her, concern furrowing his brow. "What do you mean?" Valen's face grew pale, her eyes distant as she focused on something only she could sense. "It's not them. Something else is coming. Something worse." Riven's stomach dropped. The air around them seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't explain, an almost suffocating pressure. He reached out to Valen, pulling her closer to him as the ground beneath them began to tremble. "Stay close," he said urgently. "Whatever it is, we need to be ready." Before he could react, a shadow appeared on the horizon, moving fast, too fast for any human or creature they'd encountered before. It was a dark shape, hovering just above the ground, its form shifting and undulating in ways that made Riven's mind reel. The closer it came, the more the air seemed to crackle with an unsettling energy. Valen's grip tightened on his arm. "That's not possible," she murmured, her voice filled with disbelief. "It can't be." Riven's gaze snapped to her. "What is it?" It's an Rakai," she said, her voice trembling with fear. "An ancient being from my people's past. They were thought to be extinct. No one has seen one in centuries." Riven swallowed hard. "What does it want?" Valen shook her head, her face pale. "It doesn't care about us. It cares about what's inside me." Riven's mind reeled. He had no idea what she meant, but he could see the terror in her eyes, the sheer panic that gripped her. Whatever this thing was, it was far beyond anything they had encountered so far. And it wasn't something they could fight. "Run," Valen said suddenly, her voice filled with desperation. "We have to run. It will destroy us if we don't." Without another word, she grabbed his hand, and they took off down the pass. The world around them seemed to distort as the shadow grew closer, its form now unmistakable, a swirling mass of dark energy and twisted light that moved with terrifying speed. Riven's legs burned as they sprinted, but he pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever this creature was, they had to escape. But with every step, he could feel the presence of their Kai closing in, its energy overwhelming the air around them. "Where do we go?" he gasped, barely able to catch his breath. "There's nowhere to hide." Valen's expression twisted with uncertainty, but then her eyes locked onto something in the distance. "The cave!" she shouted, pointing to a jagged opening in the mountainside. "We can make it to the cave. It might give us enough time to lose it." Riven didn't need another word. He urged Valen forward, his body pushing past exhaustion as they neared the cave. The ground beneath them rumbled again, and he felt the air crackle with energy, their Kai's power bearing down on them. They reached the cave just as the creature was almost upon them. Riven turned to face the entrance, panting heavily as Valen slid inside first. He followed closely behind, barely ducking in time as a massive shockwave of energy blasted the mountainside. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and rocks tumbled around them. The cave was narrow, but it provided a small respite from the chaos outside. They collapsed against the walls, breathless, their hearts still racing. Valen's eyes were wide with fear, but she forced herself to calm. "We can't stay here long," she said, her voice trembling. "It will find us." Riven nodded, his mind spinning with the revelation. Their Kai, this ancient being, was after her, not just because of who she was, but because of something inside her. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was something far beyond his understanding. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We'll survive this." And together they would. The days inside the cave blurred together as Riven and Valen huddled in the dim, flickering light of their makeshift fire. Their Kai had come close several times, its ominous presence shaking the very air around them, but it had never fully entered the cave. The shadowed creature seemed to be aware of some unseen barrier that protected the narrow passage, but Riven knew it wouldn't be long before it figured out how to breach it. With every passing hour, Riven watched Valen closely, his concern growing. There was something about her, something powerful but dangerous. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she was the key to everything, the reason they were being hunted. "Valen," he started one evening, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up from where she had been tracing patterns in the dirt with her finger. The glow of the fire cast soft shadows over her face, her eyes distant, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What is it?" He hesitated, unsure how to frame his thoughts. "You're not just running from them, are you? You're not just their target. You're something else." Valen looked away, her expression shifting. "You're right," she said softly. "I didn't want to tell you like this, but the truth is, I can't hide it from you anymore." Riven felt a sinking sensation in his chest. "What do you mean?" Valen swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "I'm carrying something inside me. Something ancient. Something that belongs to their Kai. It's the reason they've come after me." I didn't even know it existed until recently, but now I can feel it, growing stronger every day. Riven's mind raced. What does it want from you? What are they going to do? Valen's eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and fear. They want to take it. The power inside me. It's a weapon, Riven. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Their Kai weren't just after Valen, they were after the power that was buried deep within her. A power that could change everything. Riven's heart clenched with a protective instinct he hadn't known he had until now. We can't let them have it. We have to find a way to destroy it. Valen's eyes softened, but there was a trace of resolve in her expression. I don't know if I can destroy it, Riven. But I can control it. I have to. I can't let them use me, or anyone else, for their own gain. Riven reached for her hand, holding it tightly in his. Then we'll fight together. You're not alone in this. I won't let them take you. For a long moment, Valen said nothing, her gaze locked on his as if searching for something in his eyes. Finally, she whispered, You're sure? After everything, you still want to be with me? Riven smiled, though it was a mixture of sorrow and determination. No matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, I want to be with you. You're my choice, Valen. Always. She didn't say anything for a while, but when she finally spoke, her voice was strong, full of the same determination. Then we make our stand. The next morning, they emerged from the cave, their faces grim but resolute. They didn't know how long they had before their Kai found them, but they knew one thing. They had to act before it was too late. Valen's powers had grown in strength over the past days, the force inside her pulsing with an energy that hummed in the air around them. Their Kai would come, they had no doubt of that. But they had one advantage, the element of surprise. Riven and Valen made their way back to the ridge, where the creature had last been seen. Valen had a plan, and she was ready to put it into motion. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, their Kai appeared, its dark form emerging from the shadows. It was as terrifying as Valen had described, its presence nearly suffocating. But this time, it wasn't just Valen who stood against it. Riven was beside her, his hand firmly clasped in hers, ready for whatever came next. You don't know what you're dealing with, Valen said, her voice steady and sure. I've made my choice. And you won't control me. Their Kai seemed to pause, its massive form shifting as if considering her words. But it didn't hesitate long. It surged forward, faster than Riven had ever seen anything move, aiming straight for Valen. In that instant, Valen raised her hands, her powers erupting in a blinding flash of light. Their Kai screamed, a horrible, unnatural sound, as the energy from her burst outward, engulfing it in a wave of raw force. The earth trembled beneath their feet as the creature was pushed back, its form writhing in agony. Riven felt the heat of the energy around them, the power that Valen had unleashed. It was beyond anything he could have imagined. She was no longer just the girl he had met by chance. She was a force of nature, capable of wielding the very elements to protect herself, and him. With one final cry, their Kai vanished into the ether, its presence dissipating like smoke in the wind. Valen collapsed to her knees, exhausted from the battle, but victorious. Riven was at her side in an instant, his arms wrapping around her. You did it, he whispered. You saved us. Valen looked up at him, her eyes filled with something softer than fear now, hope. We did it, she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. Together. And as the sun set behind the mountains, they knew the battle was over, for now. Their Kai had been defeated, but their journey was far from finished. There would be other challenges, other forces that sought to tear them apart. But they were ready. Together, they had faced the unknown, and together, they would face whatever came next.